My name is Georg Rüschemeyer. I work at Cochrane, Germany, here in Freiburg. Very warm and sunny Freiburg today. And I've been here for a good 3 years now. And before that, I worked as a freelance science journalist for quite a few years, about 18 years, nearly 2 decades of freelancing. Yeah, that's my background. Today, we're meeting here in a small round to discuss the question of sanctions for failing to register or report our clinical trial data. And my job is just basically to say this and then hand over to you guys. And we did a strictly randomized selection of what order we go in. And the first one who came up here is Gustav. And it would be great, as Till wrote before, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and then do a little statement of what you think would be the right way of sanctionizing or not sanctionizing this issue. All right. Gustav.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm Gustav Nilsson. I'm a neuroscientist and a meta-scientist based in Sweden. Some of the research I do is on following up clinical trials reporting, mainly in the Nordic countries. Now, I was thinking about how to frame this issue, and one thing I thought of is a kind of clash between two systems or perspectives, and I pulled out of my bookcase this guide, The Young Man's Path to Minerva by Ragnar Granit, one of the Nobel laureates, a neuroscientist from the last century. He compares life as a scientist to life as an artist. He describes being a scientist in a way that has very many similarities to the creative process of an artist. You think, you come up with new ideas, you test them, you proceed according to your imagination and your inspiration, and you create something new. And this is something I believe many researchers are happy to experience from time to time, and is maybe one of the motivating reasons for choosing an academic career. And this is encapsulated sometimes in the concept of academic freedom. We have the freedom as scientists to choose which questions to investigate, but also to choose how to report our results, in which context, in which forum, in which way. However, there is also, of course, the regulatory perspective, which is extremely important because, as we know, clinical trials data have enormous impact on medical practice, and it's a matter literally of life and death for patients that results from clinical trials are accurately and promptly reported. But our systems for conducting science are still in many ways designed for the lone genius who proceeds according to his or her imagination and inspiration. Now, personally, what I favor in order to improve quality in science is to make better incentives for scientists, provide better support, and increase the institutional responsibility. So, for example, if I run a clinical trial, I believe that my university or hospital should not delegate the entire responsibility to me. There should be mechanisms in place such that if I die, or if I move to another country, or if I get a new job in industry, the institution needs to be there and step up and ensure that the results are properly kept and analyzed and reported. And of course, they also need to ensure that that happens if I still work there. So in general, I believe we will be well suited by finding ways to improve researchers' means to do the right thing, but hopefully without sanctioning individuals. Sanctioning institutions, I would be much more favorable to. And that's my attempt at starting off this discussion.
Thank you very much. Let's just go over. I mean, we will have most of the time for discussing anyway. Let's go on to Birgit and see what she has to say about this.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm Birgit Wittmann. I'm Head of Research Governance and Integrity at the University of Birmingham. I've been in this role here in the university for over 4 years, and in Bristol for over 11 years. And before that, I've worked in the NHS for about 20 years. So I suppose I've been in this game for quite a long time, and that's where I wanted to start, in as much that I think over the time I've been working with this, we've seen a very positive evolution on trial reporting. So when I first started, I think there weren't many researchers and many administrator or professional services people aware of the reporting needs, and that over time has changed. So we have seen through awareness raising and through supporting, through developing institutional processes, that we can actually get the message out there that this is an important part. So it's not just, you have the idea, you get the funding, you conduct the study and you're done, but actually that trial reporting is an essential element. And you need to think about that actually from the moment you apply for funding, to make sure you've got the right funding to actually upload the results at the end, and you've got the right statistical support and so on. So we've seen that changing, and I have seen that changing, and I have been part of that change. Taking an institution from being branded by our lobbyist as totally non-conformant to 100% trial registration. And that has been a really positive journey. It has been a positive journey to foster a really open research culture and to provide the right support for the researchers, for the team, to upskill the teams I've been leading, to put the resources into the teams to do that. So for me, sanctions wouldn't have achieved this at all. It would have just increased the bureaucracy and a culture that I really don't want to foster in this. And so it is my view that sanction would achieve the opposite from the culture I want to see coming into the community and developing further into the community. We're seeing brilliant moves into the open research culture, and that's really developing beautifully. It is enhancing reproducibility. We see that through those sort of movements. And then finally, I think having the results out there is missing an important point. It's making these results accessible for our participants in the trials. So just because the results are out there on some registry doesn't actually mean that the participant in our trials will actually understand those. So we have a really, I would much rather put my energy into that. So in the UK, we have the Health Research Authority, which has a make it public strategy. And I think that's a really fundamental part of getting our reporting right. So yes, of course, the trial has to be reported. We have to have the data open in some open research forum. But we need to make sure that our participants are able to understand what we're putting out there and that they are informed and included in the right way. So for me, sanctions in any shape or form takes us into a direction where we would put energy and resource into something that will not achieve where I think the research community needs to go.
Thank you. It's an interesting perspective that I haven't put probably enough thought into the participant perspective. Let's go on with our randomized order with Till, please.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, just to start with, I mean, I agree with Gustav and with Birgit in two important ways. I agree with Gustav that I'm strongly in favor of sanctions on institutions, but I don't think that sanctions on individuals are appropriate. Why not? Because if you're a principal investigator working at Birgit's institution, the results will be made public on time. Because Birgit has created those systems and those processes that ensure that results are made public. So chasing after 100,000 individuals in the medical research community is far less efficient than, making sure that institutions do what they're meant to be doing. I also very much agree with Birgit. I did a study maybe a year or two ago of people working in preclinical animal research. That is an area where one of the interviewees said to me, if you're doing this kind of work in this particular country, you always have the feeling that you've got one foot in jail already, because it's a very confrontational and toxic relationship with the regulators in part. It makes it incredibly difficult within the community to openly discuss problems. It creates a sort of spirit that is really contrary to everything that we want to see in research. So I'm in favor of sanctions, but I think that sanctions should be like a last bottom line, a last resort. When all else fails. Why do I think that sanctions are appropriate? First of all, it's normal for an institution to face a sanction if it breaks the rules. So right now you might have a cancer patient parking outside a hospital to participate in a clinical trial. If she parks a car in the wrong place, she will get a parking ticket and she has to pay that parking ticket. But if the hospital doesn't make the clinical trial result public, as Gustav said, endangering many, many lives, the hospital faces no consequences whatsoever. Is that fair? No. Is that appropriate? No. So I think for that reason, sanctions are appropriate. The second point is that voluntary compliance has a history of failure of delivering 100%. I think realistically, we can never get to 100% of clinical trials registered and reported, especially reported, if there aren't any sanctions in place. I mean, in the UK, there have been like really strong efforts to improve clinical trial reporting. They've been hugely successful, not only at positive outlier institutions like the University of Birmingham, but across the board, I think. But we're still far from 100%. And closing that last 1% gap, I think, will always require sanctions. And third, I think we need to remember that we're working in a community where we're dealing with 99% or more of people who are good actors. You know, people go into medical research because they want to help other people. People want to do the right thing. You know, there's so much goodwill that I've encountered over the past few years, but there are a few bad actors out there. So if you've got a pharmaceutical company that ran a phase 4 trial on a product that is already on the market, and they discovered adverse effects, they discovered safety signals during that trial, they discovered a lack of efficacy, and they refused to make those trial results public. I think there needs to be a legal mechanism to force that company to make the trial results public, to keep people safe, to keep patients safe. But just to wrap up, it should be targeted at institutions, not at individuals. And it should be a last resort measure. So there should always be 1-2 warning emails, warning letters, giving people the chance to please do the right thing before you start chasing them with sanctions. Yep, and that's from me.
Thank you very much. And then finally, it's to Sarah White, who I guess you have the American perspective where they're
I'm going to bring that.
Yeah, and there's this crazy number about how many fines could have already been put out there in the US based on the law, but it hasn't been done. So it's interesting to hear what your perspective is. Thanks.
Yeah, well, and hi everyone. Thank you so much, Till, for inviting me today. So I'm Sarah White. I'm the Executive Director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard here in Boston. It is not nice here today. It is cold and rainy. The MRCT Center is essentially a think, do, tank, a research and policy center looking at challenges of global clinical trials. That's my day job. I also play this role as the co-chair of a US-based task force that is very much focused on academic, university, hospitals in the US and the people that are responsible for registration and results reporting at that institution. It is a very large group. We are now at about 400 members. We get about 170 people per month on task force calls. So there is this huge momentum for a need of conversation and help in the academic community, all at these institutions for doing the right thing. The group is mostly focused on FDA, or the federal regulations for registration and results reporting, NIH, ICMJ, the journal requirements, and then a small sprinkle of, Veterans Affairs, Centers for Medical, Medicare and Medicaid, and a few other kind of specific requirements. So as you know, especially in the US, we've got this massive infrastructure of research. A massive number of the trials registered on clinicaltrials.gov are at academic medical centers, universities, and hospitals. We don't, in general, have a good reputation for doing a great job. There have been potential compliance actions going back to way back, but mechanisms really being put in place since 2017 that the FDA could have taken action. As you mentioned, the federal government could have collected a lot of money based on this, and they haven't to date. As you probably know, there have been some recent recent tiptoeing in this area with a series of pre-notices to specific pharmaceutical companies or investigators that they are in compliance. Nothing, it has led to their individual compliance, but not to any sort of enforcement. And on the NIH grant side, there has not been any sort of withholding that we know about publicly of that federal grant. I want to mention very quickly that I'm sure you're all familiar, the ICMJE requirements of, so I'm assuming you're all familiar with ICMJE, but their requirements of you must register before the first patient is enrolled, that has been tremendously effective, at least in the US. And I happen to be previously to my position now, I was at Mass General and the Brigham overseeing the central registration and results reporting there, which, about 4,000 studies under kind of my direct report. There was a moment in time where ICMJE said, all right, we're ready, and started really enforcing. And we were getting phone calls from investigators saying, they won't even look at my paper. And it's like, well, you didn't comply. And so that, at least in the US, really enabled compliance, that if an investigator is really serious about doing this, they were going to register. I think when we talk about, when I think about consequences or compliance and enforcement, I do think there's a place for it. I think about the FDA regulated studies, drugs, devices, biologics. These are pivotal studies that are the basis for approval. And then obviously going into the general population, I think the public deserves to see the results of those studies. I think the public deserves to see what our massive National Institute of Health funding is paying for. And I think I want to go back to Gustav's mention of honoring the patient. We do deserve to honor the patient by being transparent about what happened in that research. So I definitely see a place for compliance and sanctions. What what I feel very strongly about, and this really plays on what I have kind of done through my career, is you got the lawmakers, you got the regulators, and then you have the investigators like Gustav, Bridget, who are doing the work. And there's a huge disconnect to you shall do and how do I do. And I think if sanctions and compliance are going to be involved, there has to be a meeting of the minds of, okay, this is what we want to do. These are the mechanisms. What are the resources that our federal government needs to actually follow through on any sort of compliance? What are the resources at the institutions that the institutions need to support the individual investigators? You know, for example, when I was at Mass General and the Brigham, I had to, so 4,000 studies, I had to fight for more than one FTE to oversee that. That is not right. I mean, you know, and you see that across the board. The whole idea of registration and results reporting at these institutions is not well funded. And not well recognized. And part of that is because we've got these sanctions and nothing's happening. I guarantee if FDA started actually following through with it, that there would be more funding. But again, I think my position is, I think that enforcement and potential sanctions are important, but I think we have a long way to go, at least in the US. And I would hope if Europe moves to this, there's a lot of critical thought about how do you make them transparent and actionable for the research community.
Thank you. Just a quick question. So I didn't tell you enough about my background. So we are working with Cochrane Germany in the moment on some advocacy action to get some regulation forward in Germany that will make sure that more trial reporting is happening. That's why it's very interesting for me to be in this discussion, even though my background isn't really in this area. So that hence my maybe stupid questions. But in the US, you said that the FDA hasn't issued the fines that they could be. Could be issuing. Is that because of a lack of interest, or is it a conscious decision in the sense of, well, this is the whip that we could get out if you don't comply, but we are hoping for if we give you a few carrots, there will be more compliance without making that necessary?
Yeah, I mean, such a fascinating question, and I'm not the FDA, and Till knows better than me that the FDA is so guarded about what they say and what they don't say. But with that said, you know, Rob Califf, the FDA commissioner, he is really, he's really dedicated to clinical trials transparency. He's got a lot of other fish to fry. The FDA has a lot of fish to fry, and whether this is something that trickles up to the top or not is questionable. We are very lucky on the task force that we have a lot of direct conversation, not only with clinicaltrials.gov, but with representatives in the FDA that are responsible for this. And again, very guarded about what they say, but you know, we understand there are mechanisms there now, but there's resource constraints, you know? And so I think it goes back to what I was saying before. There's good intentions, there's legal basis, there's mechanisms now through the US FDA's bioresearch monitoring program that can do this. I think there's a resource issue. I think the other incredibly important thing, which this doesn't necessarily kind of excuse anything, what we see publicly on the clinicaltrials.gov website is not always necessarily the truth. And when the FDA does go in to kind of inspect, they look at a study, they collect all the other information too, in addition to what's on the public website before moving forward, which is pretty time consuming and resource intensive. And we don't really know what comes of what they see publicly to the hundreds of thousands of studies that are late for results and kind of what it actually means behind that.
Okay, so but mostly resources, which is probably often a problem. So let me quickly try to sum up. I think we've heard a couple of three people who were in favor of sanctions, but more on the institutional level than on the individual level. I guess was there anyone who wanted sanctions on the individual level? I don't think so. And then Birgit was a bit more skeptical about sanctions in general, saying that in her experience and from Birmingham, the report of the scientists was very good, and it was actually possible to get the registration numbers up from basically 0 to close to 100% within just a few years, right? That was a quite recent development as far as I've followed it.
Pretty much a year. Yeah. So I had luckily the experience of another institution of doing it, but within a year we managed to get them to 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's no sanction.
Birgit, how many central resources do you all have to help you with that?
Very little. I work in quite a large university, and we have about at any one time 105, 110 interventional trials all over the world. So we have them not just in the UK. We have about 43 countries. We run our interventional trials. So it's a very large trial portfolio, international trial portfolio. And I have in the governance team 5 people, and that is how I move it forward. And then I have clinical trial units who we work with, and then obviously I've got people in the clinical trial units, but they're not central governance team. They're the people who support the researchers.
Yeah. So 5. When you say governance, does that mean 5 people that are responsible for doing the result?
For the whole sponsorship review process. So the studies will come to us, we review for sponsorship, we give comments back before they go to the regulators. Then when they come back from the regulators, we look at what responses need to be made, and then we follow it through with the conduct of the study. Obviously, the CTUs will, support the conduct of the studies if they're funded for that. Yeah. So we haven't got many, and I had to literally when I came here, I had to adjust a job description and upskill a member of the team to actually be that person who could work with the researchers who were struggling to upload, to help them upload.
Yeah.
I was wondering, maybe another basic question. From your experience, is it easy enough now to register studies and to register the results of the studies? I've talked to a couple of scientists in Germany who said, that all sounds really good in theory, but then when you try to register things, then often it's quite difficult and the websites don't work the way they're supposed to. And I don't know, it's just a thing you really don't want to do like late in the evening after your regular work time. And I think that's always been an important point, right? Make it easy, so it's easy to comply. So basically, that could be the carrot that will make it easier for people to comply. Is that in the different countries you come from? Is that good enough by now? Or I mean, I guess you could always make it better. But what's the state there?
So from my point of view, I think it's pretty much thanks to TIL and the lobbying that we've seen. We've actually seen a lot of improvement in the way the registry is working. They're not ideal yet, and we're still battling with, routinely our studies could be registered on 3 registries. Sometimes they're registering on more than one if it's US funded, for example, or NIH is involved. So you then have a double registry entry that you have to manage. While ClinGov has always been a really good registry to work with, so we could tidy up the registry. So if I run a report and I find that a study is not a study which is supported by my institution, I could actually get in touch with US colleagues and they would actually sort this out for me relatively quickly. But other registries have been really problematic, especially the EU ones, and TIL has been fundamental in helping us to, through lobbying, I think, to get the right information on how we should manage it and best practice approaches where we all could pool our resources to get this sorted. And that has helped. But I think for us, what of course is problematic is Brexit, so from the UK, we are, where we thought we were actually getting there. Now we are having to manage the Brexit element within that setting. So at the moment, we actually are running dual reporting in just about everything, and that's added another layer of complexity to the 12 reporting. So I think we are still a long way away from what I would love is one entry to a registry, and then that populates, wherever it needs to populate these registries. That would be fantastic. I think we're a long way away from it. ISRCTN, so a UK registry, I think are making really progress in the UK on this, and they're becoming sort of the registry of choice. We still have a little bit of a cost to it, so we're permanently battling with studies that are not funded to a high level. Are they going to go on ClinGov, or are they going to go on ISRCTN? And I discourage ClinGov strongly, but of course there's a registration fee, so there's a lot of sort of discussion of where's the right registration, and then who's going to maintain that registration if they do that. So the registries are getting easier, but we're not there yet.
Okay.
Gustav, do you want to go and then I'll follow you?
Sure. So I do agree that there's a scope for improvement on the technical side to make things easier, to have better interfaces and so on. But perhaps more importantly, I believe we need to make improvements to the organization of how the reporting is conducted. I don't believe that it should be delegated all the way down to the individual researcher who is responsible for a trial. I believe we need specialist support staff whose job it is to make sure that trials are properly registered, so that the researchers can, you can imagine different ways this could happen. It could be a centralized service within a university where the researcher can send in their protocol and materials, and a support person who knows intimately how the registry works can then translate that into a registration. Or perhaps even better, it could be delegated to some kind of external body at the national level, or at least above the university, whose job it would be not merely to register the trials, but also to be an independent party following up different sponsors' registration and reporting, and to provide overall statistics. And this ties back a bit to the question of sanctions. One step that I do believe should be taken before sanctions is to publish openly data on reporting by the different trial sponsors. I'm sure you're aware of the dashboard built by the Quest Center that compares university medical centers in Germany and their trial reporting. And one point I like to make is that that ought to be done routinely by a responsible agency and not as a research project. I hope I didn't take us too far out on a tangent now.
Gustav, can I ask a question about what you were saying? When you talk about the institutional support to put the data into the registry and also the statistics, who pays for that? Does the investigator pay for it per study, or does the institution fund those resources? In a perfect world.
In a perfect world, well, at the moment, I can speak to what we have at my university. We now have approximately one full-time equivalent of a person who is funded by general university overhead costs, so at no direct costs to the investigator. They're supporting new registrations, and they're also trying to work through the backlog of studies that are not reported. Yeah. And that was not very easy to get, and I can join the chorus and say that it was largely thanks to Til's lobbying, the data he put out, that we managed to get that.
Yeah, we have a variety of models at the academic institute. Just to quickly respond to that, we have a variety of models at the academic institutions In some cases, the investigators are completely responsible. The institution delegates the responsibility. There are central resources that can help advise, but not responsible for registration or results reporting, data entry. Then there's some other models where there is a central resource that can help some investigators. And then the third model with data entry and results reporting. And then there's a third model where it's actually pay per service. And I think a lot of that depends on, you know, how the institution spends, you know, their institutional funds. And I think it's an interesting model. But getting back to the original question as far as, is it easy or is it not? So clinicaltrials.gov, I think, is ever so slightly different than some of the other registries where, you know, you are basically creating rows and columns, tables to really capture the study design and the results reporting. So it's very, very much for the academic institutions, a manual process. Big sponsors, they are doing, you know, they've got some API, which is coming from their clinical trial management system and plugging it into there. My experience with academic institutions is that it's not that. It's purely manual. I think, you know, over my time, you know, doing it, being in the database and helping investigators, yeah, pretty easy. You get used to it. But if you're doing it once a year, it is definitely not easy. And there are some references that talk about registration taking about 20 hours and results reporting taking about 40 hours. That's a lot of time, you know. So I think it raises the question of, is 40 hours easy or not? You know, it's someone probably doing it at midnight, you know.
Bill is raising his hand.
Yeah, I just
Very
wanted
politely.
I just wanted to sort of curve back onto sanctions here, and I think, you know, I mean, the huge amount of time lost because registries are inefficient and, you know, because the system is really unhelpful, you know, I think we can all agree on that. If we're talking about, you know, 40 hours to report a clinical trial result, I mean, that is far too much. But then I think you also have to ask, you know, well, you know, those 40 hours, how do they compare to like all the other time that went into the clinical trial? You know, I mean, from developing the protocol to the taxpayer regulator time of reviewing that, to the institutional managed time, to the patient's time, because we shouldn't forget, you know, people might drive like, you know, 1-2 hours to, well, in the US, probably 4 hours to get like to clinical trial sites, you know, all that time that has gone into there. And we're really talking about a fraction of that. So I think if you're looking at it from an institutional perspective, you know, it's absolutely horrible. If you're looking at it from my comfortable, I don't have to deal with this far away perspective, you know, it's only a tiny fraction of the resources that go into clinical trial. But to sort of bring this back to sanctions, I just want to give Birgit a bit of a hard time because by just throwing you 2 examples of where I think that sanctions would be appropriate in a perfect world. So, and you know, these are both 2 examples that I've sort of been involved with. So the first one was the MD Anderson Cancer Center in the US, which have got a brilliant record on legal compliance, on putting the results up there when it's legally required. But 16 years ago, they ran a trial involving patients with brain cancer. They never made the results public. The German Health Technology Assessment Agency requested the results of those trials of them so that it could make an assessment. Anderson said, no, you know, we got the data, we prepared it for publication, but we couldn't find a journal to publish it. And we're not giving you the data because we think it would be irresponsible to share, you know, non-peer reviewed data, which is a weird thing to say to health technology assessment bodies. So I tried to put a bit of pressure on MD Anderson. I said, well, you know, just upload the results on clinicaltrials.gov. I mean, that's exactly what it's there for, you know, that's exactly you know, that's the function of a trial registry. You know, you don't have to wait for the journal. They didn't do that. I filed an ethics complaint. Didn't hear from them for a long time. 2 years later, I asked, well, you know, whatever happened with the ethics complaint? And I got back this email saying that, you know, well, you know, we looked at the case and we concluded that no rules were broken and, you know, everything is hunky-dory essentially, and a blog forthcoming. And at that point, you know, I mean, the results are still not up there on clinicaltrials.gov. The German Health Technology Assessment Agency still cannot assess this treatment. So German patients with brain cancer might be getting suboptimal treatment because they can't assess that. I think at that point, you know, 16 years later, yes, you know, sanctions would be appropriate. A second example is a medical device company called Cotera, based in the US, who've actually been breaking the law by not uploading trial results. I highlighted that with them several times, email, Twitter, on blogs. And for about 2 or 3 years, we saw absolutely no movement by Cotera to upload clinical trial results. And only recently, maybe 6 months ago, they started to upload some results. So I think right now, 3 of their 22 clinical trials have results up there. I've got no idea what happened internally there. Maybe they got an FDA letter, a notice of pre-notice of non-compliance, and that sort of focused their minds. Maybe they had a change in staff and just decided that it was the time to do this. But, you know, after, you know, 3-4 years after raising the issue very publicly, you know, that company still hasn't put all its results out there by a far measure. And I think, you know, that is the kind of hard case that I'm talking about. So I'd just like to have Birgit's perspective on, you know, if we don't have sanctions in that context, you know, what is the alternative here?
Well, for me, it's a culture thing. It's a culture that we want to foster. There too is especially those people who dig in. Now, it's very difficult for me to comment. I don't know what's happened there, but you know, if I have people who don't engage, then I need to find a way of engaging them, and very often. So when I first came here, there were some trials which just couldn't upload results because there had been an inspection and it was found that the data should not be used, and we cleared that with the regulator. Now it might be something like this. There is a story behind the scenes that cannot go in the public domain, and therefore the results are not uploaded. So there are circumstances sometimes where results are not uploaded because it wouldn't be appropriate to upload results that have come into question through some shape or form. So it might do that. If it is a resource thing, clearly, you know, that should come out. So if there is a, I mean, obviously we had those discussions. So when we couldn't upload results because we just couldn't get it sorted on the registry, if it's that, then obviously we need to iron those out. So there will be some hurdle, because normally, so what I would usually expect is that a researcher would want to get the results out there. So if it's one of our researchers, clearly they are assessed by the research output, and it would be very unusual for a researcher not to publish the results. That in a higher education institution, that would be very unusual. Now, I don't know if this was in a hospital or not. So if it's in a hospital, and take our NHS hospital, for example, at the moment, we have a totally overloaded workforce post-COVID, and I expect that's the same maybe in other places. So has there just not been the time? So I would just want to understand what is behind the scene happening, which you would normally expect. Like, somebody should be proud of that study, and if they're not proud of that study, then there's a reason why they're not, and there's either a regulatory reason or they're just having the time to write it up, or too much pressure, not enough support, not enough technical knowledge. So and now if you think this is 16 years ago, I think the stuff is outdated anyway. So we might as well start again, because things no doubt would have changed in treatment and whatever we're doing. So I think 16 years later, you might as well forget it. So this has to happen contemporaneously, I think, because research moves on so fast that we certainly wouldn't want some outdated stuff out there, which was set out 16 years ago. For the company, I feel the same. I haven't worked with companies. I've never worked in the commercial sector, so not sure. But a company normally would be in it for money, I would have thought, to make money out of those things. So have they not put it into regulatory approval processes to put the product on the market? Or so that would be my question to them, of how did they get licensed or whatever for the stuff if they haven't put the results somewhere.
Well, I mean, it could be, for example, post-approval studies. So, in many cases, there are studies done where there's absolutely no regulatory obligation to run the study. And I think from a commercial perspective, it's completely understandable that if the results don't show what you hope that they were going to show, then you're not going to splash them all over the internet. And I think that's a very, very clear commercial incentive. And I'm not even going to go and call companies evil for not doing that, because I think that's just what, that's just the market logic behind these things. But I do think that there should be some regulatory safeguards and a red line at some point where it's just like, well, actually, sorry, you involve patients in this, patients volunteer to participate in this, whatever intervention you're testing is actually on the market, or you were hoping to generate some scientific benefit, otherwise this wouldn't have gotten ethics approval. So I do think it's appropriate to have a red line there, but that, for individual clinical trials, that sometimes the results have to be written off. I mean, I've seen that on the European registry, and I agree with that. I mean, I just submitted a preprint yesterday that argued the same thing, that sometimes there needs to be a pathway to write off individual studies. But I just think that at some point, as a very last resort, you just need that. And as Sarah said, just for the regulator to have that resort, I think can really help to convince institutions to invest in building those kind of systems. For me, like, the question is, when I'm looking at this sort of, the US model seems to be, okay, we can fine you up to $13,000 per day that a trial is overdue. Now, we gasp and say that's a lot of money. If I was running like a pharmaceutical company that was putting out a blockbuster drug with a turnover of, say, $6 billion a year for that single drug, and there was like a single unflattering trial result, I definitely take like the $13,000 a day and I pay that for the results not to be made public. So I think that's a sort of, might not be the right way. Then you're looking like at the more European approach, where they're saying, oh, we're going to give people like a small one-off fine. I think that's good at concentrating minds in non-commercial sponsors. But again, for commercial sponsors, that doesn't really work. But the Europeans have like the backfall of, yes, we can actually put you into prison in extreme cases. And then you got the UK one where they say, well, we're just not going to approve new trials, which I think is a great approach if the results are missing. Because you can say, well, you've got the results, you put them up there and everything's fine again, and, life can go on as normal. But if somebody failed to register clinical trial, then in a way the damage is already done. So how are you going to hold approvals? How long are you going to hold them for? Is this really to the benefit of patients? So I think there needs to be a lot of thinking about how to do it, but I do think there should be a red line.
So what's your personal favorite in terms of what kind of sanctions would be the most appropriate? I think it just sounded like maybe the stopping any further research until you've finished up the last one. Is that it?
For reporting results, I think that's a good approach. Unless, of course, you're dealing with a company that's just got one product on the market and that doesn't care because they're not starting up any more clinical trials. What I'm really in favor of is like having great discussions like we're having now, before somebody goes and like writes a really ill-informed law, as we've seen all over North America and Europe. You know, I mean, I really think there's benefit in having these discussions, and we need a lot more discussions like this.
And Sarah raised her hand. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I did see Gustav raising his actual hand though, so I just want to make sure if he had something to say, you should jump in front of me, Gustav.
Okay, thanks. Well, I just wanted to respond briefly to catch on to one of the things Birgit said. I do agree very much with the general idea, Birgit, of fostering a culture and building normative expectations among academic researchers. But I thought your statement was maybe more charitable towards us academic researchers than we deserve. Don't you think there's a lot of publication bias going on where researchers just don't get the results that they hope for, and then it ends up in the file drawer and we move on to something else?
I'm aware that happens, of course, but you know, that is coming back to, you know, what culture are we fostering? Are we actually fostering a culture where we say, you know, whatever you do, good, positive or negative result, or you know, whatever, is going to be valuable, and you're going to be recognized for that, even if your, you know, amazing study suddenly doesn't show that what you had hoped for, or you know, through whatever reason didn't recruit enough people and you can't show this. But, you know, if I have a culture which says to these people, look, wherever you get it, you have to get it out there, wherever you're going to put it. So I come through the hospital ranks, worked in surgery, and I was really lucky to work with a surgeon who's, whatever we did, and honestly, my stuff really wasn't earth-shattering, he made me publish. He said, you whatever it is, and if we don't get it into this journal, we tried probably 10 others, eventually we got it in some, you know, nondescript journal, but it was out there. And so I was working with someone who basically said, you know, you're on a learning curve, this is not earth-shattering research, but you need to put it out there, you need to now publish. And that is what we should foster as a culture. You know, it doesn't have to be absolutely, you know, Nobel Prize stuff for it to be published. It should just be out there in the public domain, and we should help people do that. So there is something in the UK. Obviously, we have the research assessment via the publications. As you know, all our researchers are assessed every 5 years and graded into, you know, whatever 4-star, 5-star papers they're writing and stuff. So that is fostering a very specific culture, and we have to, as a nation, ask ourselves, is that really what we want to do? Is that really what's going to bring out the best ideas? And are these people then publishing? Because they will put it in the drawer and publish something else, which is probably going to be higher rated and stuff. So it is work on this that values, you know, if we do the research, we should get it out there, because it will help others just to start somewhere different. You know, if mine didn't work out, then actually someone else will be able to say, okay, well, that didn't work, so I'll try something else, providing, you know, it is reliable and we have an open approach to our research. So now we have a very open research agenda. We are encouraging people to share their results. Even though they don't publish, they can still put the results out, even in an institutional registry. So the stuff is out there. So we would, yeah, I just think we need to come away from this sort of cutthroat approach and actually get people involved and hopefully enjoy the research they do and have that learning curve.
Bridget, you should write up a case study on the University of Birmingham and how you have fostered that culture of compliance. I mean, I think that could be a neat contribution to the community. You know, I think back of my time when I was overseeing the central registration results reporting program, and you know, there were these conversations about, okay, well, if we get fined for this study that is out of compliance, even if it, so if it's an NIH study, the grant recipient, who is the institution, is the person that is sanctioned. And, the conversation would be, okay, well, the fine comes to the institution. Institution's like, I'm not paying for it. Department can pay for it. Department chief, I'm not paying for it. The investigator can pay for it. And so there's this kind of passing off, which goes completely against, Bridget, what you're saying, but I don't think that's uncommon. And I think when we talk about a culture of compliance, Bridget, to your point, kind of really appreciating not only the positive results, but the negative results, because we all learn from negative research results as well. And also drawing on a publication that Deborah Zarin, so Deborah Zarin was the director of clinicaltrials.gov. When she left clinicaltrials.gov, she actually came to the MRCT Center to pursue her research interests. She published a paper about non-informative trials and thinking about how many trials do we have out there that are recruiting, enrolling patients that are actually not going to inform anything, And so if we think about clearing the clutter, really having informative trials that can lead to some sort of change. Hopefully they get positive results. Maybe they don't, but that's all still important. And then kind of thinking about once, that leads, Bridget, to that, I would hope so, leads to that culture of compliance that you're talking about. But I think you should write up a case study.
Well, thank you, but I have.
I know you're probably busy.
I did a case study for you once, Till, didn't I, about Bristol? I think. So maybe I'll do another one. But yeah, I actually share your point about. So that's the other thing I've got. So I look after the PGR community here, so the postgraduate community, and obviously you can have an MSc study and. In theory, if you apply WHO guidelines, that should register. But is it really the right thing that we register that and go through all of that? And actually, it's an MSc study. It's a 1-year research project. It's highly unlikely to, it's really a learning curve for research rather than actually about the research results itself. So we need to be quite realistic of what we want out there to clutter everything up. It's already cluttered enough, I think. So you can't see what does it say? The wood before the trees, or something the English people say. So yeah.
Just before Gustav talks, I do have a 10 o'clock call, so I'll stay right until that minute. And then if the conversation keeps going, I'll follow up.
We'll wrap it up quite soon, but Gustav, yes.
There's one thing I wanted to say while we still have a minute or 3. Clinical trials research is just the beginning. Other research, especially on humans, but also on animals and more broadly, has learned a lot from the registration mandates in clinical trials research. It took many years for the ICMJE recommendations to really come through the system and become fully accepted and enforced. That started somewhere around 20 years ago, I believe. In my from where I'm sitting, it seems that pre-registration of other kinds of experimental research has really taken off in the last 5 years approximately. And I think this debate about clinical trials is going to shape also how we work with other kinds of research designs, maybe animal research as the first next step, but also other basic research experiments on humans, and so on, which is exciting. And perhaps I'll take the opportunity also to say that I'm coming out of this debate slightly less convinced that sanctions are a good idea. I do believe they have a place, but I want to go back to George's horse riding allusion. Sometimes it's enough that you're holding a whip and the horse knows it.
It's just the idea of the whip that we need, right? You don't actually want to ever use it. Well, it's 1 minute to the hour, and I hope for me, was very interesting to hear all your points of views. Are we a lot closer to knowing what the right sanction is? Maybe not really, but I think it's a very slow process, and it's definitely going to be interesting for what we're doing in the moment in Germany to get a better idea, better grasp of what the sanctions might be.